Good afternoon. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. I've been working since early this morning on today's Popcast. Oh, wait a minute. I made a mistake here. I forgot to bring this mic down close. Okay. And for a number of reasons, every now and again, I think we've reached a point where it's good to stop and do a recap. The first 21 Popcasts I recapped in 22, and I felt like they constituted pretty much the whole of my point of view that I think is worth talking to you about. And then I wanted to, get into more details of the point of view. The first podcast were just an overview. So I started with treatment in more detail of what awe is, and then how you use your experience of awe to enter the middle, between the extremes in society that we would like to sort of tone down. The society is fairly divided, and so we'd like to recreate the middle, and we'd like to move ourselves into it. So I talked about how that could happen. Then I talked quite a bit about the evolution of the gift of each other. So I'm going to finish the evolution of the gift of each other today, and then tomorrow and Tuesday, I'm going to do a 2-day recap. There's been a lot of material covered, and I've listened to most of the podcasts and made notes on what needs to be included in the recap, and I think we need 2 days for it. So then Wednesday is my, I keep looking at the mic, or I'm sorry. I keep forgetting to look at the camera, which is the center of the computer monitor. So the mic is lovely. So is my picture on the monitor, but the camera's really what counts. Ain't life a bitch. Okay, so Wednesday, June the 17th, 2020 is my 59th wedding anniversary. Gail and I were married in 1960. That's not correct. We were married in 61. So next year will be our 60th wedding anniversary. And so 59 is pretty big. Not a lot of people get there. And our life together has been very, very fabulous. Just rich and rewarding and wonderful and alive and lively and fecund and productive. And there's just a lot of good stuff. And so I'm going to go see her at, they were allowing me to come in. I'll see her on Wednesday. We'll have a little time together. And so I'm not going to be doing a podcast that day. And I kind of think I need to take a few days off because I have to do some reading and thinking about how we're going to proceed. I like to have, relatively topics that are connected to each other and where the connection is pretty, plain to see. So, like this last 20 some podcasts have been about awe and the middle and each other. So, pretty much the core subject. So I have to go back and look and choose what next piece needs to be worked on, and then select the main books that I'm going to use to work on it. So I think I need a few days off, and um, there's a certain emotional content to Wednesday as well, and I'm trying to be honest about that. Um, so today we're going to talk about the last piece from Deacon's book. Today is Popcast 48, and its title is Part 9 of the Evolution of the Gift of Each Other. So, how did these creatures that are our ancestor species, that are referred to as hominids, um, how did they begin use of symbols? The only about 2 million years ago did the species called Homo erectus arise, and our ancestor species before that are referred to as hominids. And so, how did it happen that they needed the symbols to deal with the inherent conflict between bonded pair living in society and social living? But how did they do it? As Deacon says, they had chimpanzee-like brains. And on page 402, he has a quote about how could they have succeeded with their chimpanzee-like brains in achieving the use of symbols. He says the answer is ritual, that ritual has the power to both create and support rituals in this, symbols in a society, that you didn't need to begin by having words, that symbols can be communicated without words. He said that actually the species at the time, the hominids, didn't have the motor control evolution in the brain and this physical size evolution of the brain that were needed for language. So language didn't begin until about 2 million years ago, but Deacon says that symbol use began about 2.5 million years ago in the antecedent species, Australopithecus, I think he's talking about. So he says they used vocalizations, but they were short of language. And they also used exchanges, and such as, oddly enough, we still do. They exchanged rings in the wedding ceremony, and they wore ceremonial clothing, and they exchanged other objects. And they sometimes, in some groups, they ritually scarred themselves on the face or elsewhere on the body. And there were gestures and other activities that were used together. So this complex of ways of supporting this arrangement of living in bonded pairs and living socially together was possible even for the species with a relatively small brain and without yet the power for speech, for language, that they did have the power of vocalizations, and these ceremonial activities that were ritualized, along with the vocalizations that were ritualized, would permit the achievement of symbols. And he's pointing out that this is a really incredible difference, that no prior species is able to use symbols, and that symbol use has been tried to be taught very elaborately to modern chimpanzees and other creatures, and they're largely unsuccessful. There are certain tricks that have to be done to begin to use symbols that are just simply beyond the capacity of the brains. And he tells stories about 2-year-olds being shown 2 piles of candy, one large and one small, and being asked which one they want. And of course, they choose the big pile. And then the big pile is then given to somebody else. And it doesn't take the kids long to figure out that when you're asked which pile do you want, you pick the small one. And that way the other kid gets the small one and you get the big one. But he said, chimps and the like that this has been tried with just can't figure it out. It's just, they just never get it. They always pick the big pile, even when they are upset to see the big pile being given to another chimp. They still keep picking the big pile. It's just not something they're capable of doing, capable of learning. And he's pointing this out that we're unique among all species in having the power to use symbols, and that arose because we needed to use symbols in order to live the way we started to live, and that arrangement of needing symbols caused our cultural life to enter into coevolution with with natural selection, so that our brains responded to our needs, and they grew large enough to handle a complex psychology and complex language and increasingly more complex ritual symbols. And he gives examples of how important symbols still are in our modern lives, and how they're taught. We perhaps don't recognize as much how widely symbols are still part of our life, because they're very subtly woven into the fabric of society. You wouldn't necessarily realize that, oh, I'm in a symbolic process here. He also talks a little bit about this particular effort to mediate peace, and how difficult it is, because it's very easy for the symbols that people are using about their peaceful intention to be just a front for a lie, that they intend to kill you as soon as they trick you into putting down your arms. And so that you have a very high chance when two groups are trying to mediate peace between them, you have a very high chance that there'll be deception, but you also have a very high consequence if there is deception. So there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of anxiety about this whole process, and he gives an interesting example of the Yanomamo Indians of the rainforest of Venezuela and northern Brazil. They are relatively aggressive towards each other. The tribes frequently raid the other tribes and steal and do harm to them. But every now and again, a tribe is in a difficult situation where they do hunting, but they also do subsistence gathering. So if their subsistence farming of a sort, so if the place where they're getting their gathering from begins to be overgrown and they are not getting enough food that way, they need to move. And a move exposes them to a great deal of danger from the other tribes. So they need to make peace. And they have evolved, perhaps that's not the correct word, a ritual has been created among the Yanomamo Indians when one tribe wants to have peace, at least for a while, with another tribe, whereby the tribe who wants the peace tells the others, come over, we're having a big feast and you're invited. And the tribe that is hosting reclines on their hammocks without any of their weapons. And when the other tribe, slowly, cautiously enters the village, they see these people reclining and they see that there's no weapons near their hands. And they then come in with weapons. The visiting tribe comes in with weapons, and they come right up to the hammocks and they raise their weapons in a threat-like manner over the heads of the hosts. And the hosts are obliged to remain completely, chill. They don't flinch, they don't cringe, they don't jump up and knock the guy over before he can strike. Um, it's the ritual. And then when the guests have done this, the guests put down their weapons, and the host then goes and collects their weapons. The host collects the host's own weapons and then advances on their guests in a threat-like manner. And the guests are obliged to stay chill, not to flinch, not to run, not to grab their own weapons and start a nice fight. And in this manner, both sides ritually communicate to the other that there will be peace, at least for a while. And then they have this fabulous feast. And then there's peace, and then there's war again. He's pointing out that our current situation about pair bonding, it has a good deal of this lack of trust in it as well. So they began pair bonding a long time ago. It was a new thing, so perhaps a lot of mishaps were to be expected. But, nowadays we more or less expect that if someone pledges to, love us forever, that we would like to think that they will keep that pledge. And yet there's still a good deal of distrust. And he points out that the soap operas are full of stories, and they have, new versions of the story every day. And the key to the story is that people do break their vows, and that people are distrustful of whether their partner will keep their vows. So this whole thing of distrust didn't just go away as soon as we invented symbols and rituals. But it, essentially his answer to how did we begin symbols, how did we become so dramatically different from any other species in the history of the world, is that rituals allowed us to do it. And his closing point is, and this is his closing point to the book, that the coevolution of brain and society occurred, that social evolution reshaped the brain in its own image, and that our anatomy, our neurobiology, and our psychology have all been shaped by the use of symbols, and that symbols are intrinsically social. They're not intended just for our own edification or for our relations to the core of our own psychology, to the all that we find there. We can indeed have symbolic thoughts that are personal, but symbols represent something, and they cause somebody else to have something come to his or her mind. And so they're referential. They reference something. They represent something. And in that regard, that's their greatest importance in representing an abstract something to other people. I mean, it's not so hard to represent a plate of food to other people. You just pick up a plate of food. But the concept of bonded pair, bonding, that needs symbolic representation, that needs symbolic reference, and that's intrinsically social. And so I think I have offered enough about the evolution of the gift of each other. I'm going to quit And tomorrow and the next day, we'll do a recap. Okay, take care.